Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good night, possibly as well. Welcome on behalf of the Diplomacy Training Program to all of the participants in this second webinar in our series on human rights defenders and diplomats. We're very pleased to see you all here. My name is Patrick Earle. I'm the Executive Director of the Diplomacy Training Program, one of the hosts and partners for this webinar, together with Frontline Defenders based in Dublin. The Diplomacy Training Program, as many of you know, is a small NGO affiliated with the Faculty of Law and Justice based at the University of New South Wales and its Faculty of Law and Justice. We would like first to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are on here in Sydney, the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to any Indigenous peoples who are joining us today for this webinar. We acknowledge that the land we're on was never ceded, and that the struggle for rights of Indigenous peoples, for the right to self-determination, is an ongoing one. We pay our respects to all of those who've been involved in that struggle over very many years. It's a good basis for us, I think, to acknowledge this as we enter this discussion around the importance of human rights, importance of work of human rights defenders, and what can be done to make sure the space is safe for people to do work around human rights and their shared values. Without wanting to take up any more time, I think we'll have a very good discussion. Very grateful to our speakers who are joining us today from Switzerland and from Sri Lanka, from the Swiss government, Cecilia, from Sri Lanka as a renowned human rights defender, Ruki, and also to Alvaro in Dublin, who will be our host and moderator. So it gives me great pleasure to pass on to you, Alvaro, and to say again, thank you to everybody who's joining us today, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Patrick, and many thanks to everyone who is joining us today from around the world based on their registrations. So good morning, good afternoons. My name is Álvaro Gómez del Valle. I am the Senior Advocacy Lead with Frontline Defenders, the International Foundation for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders. Frontline Defenders is based in Ireland, as Patrick mentioned, but we operate globally, seeking to provide holistic protection to human rights defenders in every country of the world where they operate, which, as we see, is really every country in the world. We have particular expertise on security and protection, and we really work on implementation on the UN Declaration for Human Rights Defenders, which is really our guiding document and the guiding document of states and civil society in the field of protection of human rights defenders, in the field of who is a human rights defender, etc. As our informal motto at Frontline Defenders goes, we seek to protect one to empower 1,000. We really see the transformational impact that one human rights defender, a community working together to protect human rights, has on a huge variety of issues. We talk from land rights, freedom of expression, reproductive rights, LGBT rights, freedom from torture. We are going through extremely challenging times. I don't think that's controversial to say. So it's more crucial than ever that we do this sort of all hands on deck effort to push towards a world in which human rights defenders can do their work safely. But how does this kind of effort look like? Well, that's the purpose of this series of webinars that we are partnering with the Diplomacy Training Program to explore. This is the second webinar in the series. On the first one, we started with the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, and we went a bit deep into the European Union and its tools for protection of human rights defenders, including their guidelines for support. The focus in this second webinar is slightly different. We are more moving towards the practice itself, and we want to look at it from two different perspectives, because as I said before, for protection to be effective, it has to come from different angles and different players. From one side, we will have the perspective from government, from diplomats, And we are lucky to be joined by Cecilia Neyroud from the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, but also the lived experience of a human rights defender himself, who not only has done the work, but who has felt in his own life the importance and the value of such diplomatic action in defense of human rights. And that is Ruki Fernando, who is a prominent human rights defender from Sri Lanka. I will introduce them shortly, but before, some housekeeping notes. This webinar will take around 1 hour and a half. We will have the two speakers I just mentioned, who will deliver remarks of between 15 and 20 minutes. And then we will open the floor for questions. The useful reminder for webinars to please mute your microphones, but if possible, it's be great to keep your video on. I see, so many different faces, so many different backgrounds. It's always nice to not feel we are talking into the void. So if you can, if your internet allowed, if your security situation allows, it's great if you keep your camera on. A note on the security precisely. We have had a lot of registrants. It's a open webinar, it's public. So we are not monitoring who will join of the registrants. Please be mindful of your own security situation, especially those of you who are working in more restrictive environments, those of you who are human rights defenders. Feel free to not use your real name and not share too much of the details of your own experience if you feel that might put you at risk. The webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on the website of the Diplomacy Training Program and in YouTube. Well, the questions and the comments will be addressed after the interventions, but feel free to already share them in the chat at any time, and they will be addressed towards the end. Any links, any reference documents that we reference during this webinar will be posted in the chat throughout the webinar, so you can also use those as reference. And I believe they will be shared in a follow-up email as well for participants. So yeah, if you didn't get the name of anything in particular, don't worry, just keep an eye on the chat and it will be posted there. And now that we are done with the housekeeping notes, allow me to introduce properly our first speaker, Cecilia, joining us from Switzerland. Cecilia is a senior diplomat with the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. She has extensive experience engaging with the UN's human rights mechanisms and in training human rights defenders. Today, we will hear as she draws from her experience and her knowledge of the work of Swiss diplomats across the world to share practical guidance on how can diplomats help protect defenders and the valuable work that they do. I can also just add from a personal note, Cecilia and I have worked on several cases together, and she doesn't only talk the talk, but she's walking the talk. So I'm looking forward to hear from her. Cecilia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alvaro, for the nice words. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you for the opportunity. I don't know, Annelise, if you can upload the presentation, that would be great. Thank you so much. Maybe with the first slide, with the title one. Great, thank you so much. Switzerland has long been recognized as an ally state when it comes to human rights defenders. We were one of the first countries to launch human rights defenders guidelines, and many colleagues around the world have worked to meet, to exchange with human rights defenders, and have put some have launched like a protection instrument to help human rights defenders. Ruki will give us a concrete example later on. And for my presentation today, I will try to give you an overview of our current practice in this respect, starting with the strategic framework. If we can move to the other slide. Perfect. Thank you so much. So basically, when it comes to foreign policy, we have a general foreign policy strategy, and then we have guidelines which implement the foreign policy strategy. And our new guidelines on human rights defenders were just launched a few months back at the Human Rights Council session in February. So they cover the period 26 to 29. And our human rights priorities thematics remain quite stable over time. You can see them on the slide. So we have the protection of freedom of expression, abolition of death penalty, prevention of torture, protection of minorities and vulnerable groups, women's rights and gender equality, economy and sustainability. We also speak of business and human rights. And due to the current situation, digitalization is now being covered as a cross-cutting issue for all these priority thematics. So there is a kind of continuity with our. We can stay on the other slide. Sorry. There is a kind of continuity when it comes to our human rights priorities. Regarding the fact that at the moment, we don't have human rights defenders guidelines, public ones. I mean, we still have some, but they are being transformed into an internal document which will help our diplomats around the world really to have very concrete examples of what they can do and what they cannot do. So this document will be shared. We are like finishing it, and will be shared this summer to all the Swiss representations, be it the embassies, but also the Swiss consulates, the development offices around the world, for our colleagues on the ground to be able to support best human rights defenders when they meet them and exchange with them. So regarding our actions, I would say it's based on 3 pillars, and I will develop a bit longer on those 3 pillars. So we have the bilateral level, the multilateral level, and partner organizations. So on a bilateral level, we do have human rights dialogues with a few selected countries. So we meet once a year or every 2 years to have a deep exchange on human rights. And it's really an opportunity to speak behind closed doors, and to be able also sometimes to speak about very concrete cases of human rights defenders. Otherwise, when we don't have human rights dialogue per se, we do speak of human rights during general bilateral meetings. There is almost always a point of the agenda regarding human rights, so it's also an opportunity for us to speak about the general situation of human rights defenders, but also sometimes on concrete cases, of course, if the person allows, and in close consultation with the specialized partner organizations. We do also use very discrete démarches, diplomatic démarches. So it could be, I will come to that a bit later, but the idea is really for our colleagues of the embassies to have meetings with the authorities and to be able to speak about very concrete HIV cases. Here I put a tweet. It's quite old, but it's also, I think it's something that comes more and more, the fact that posts on social media can really make a difference. So it's always also a tool for us, for our diplomacy, to use the social media. Regarding the multilateral level, you have here a picture of the beautiful ceiling of the Human Rights Council room. Switzerland engages very actively when it comes to resolutions on human rights defenders. We try to protect the language that there is. We try to reflect the latest developments, for example, the digitalization or the growing issue of TNR, etc., in the resolutions. And so there is, on the one hand, the protection of agreed language to be sure that we don't have any setbacks in a very complex environment at the moment, but also to try to reflect the new trends and developments. We also engage in interactive dialogues relevant to human rights defenders, be it with a special rapporteur on human rights defenders, but also on reprisals, etc. So Switzerland is at the moment a member of the Human Rights Council, so we have a special responsibility at the moment, but it doesn't really change anything in our practice. When it comes to human rights defenders, we have always been very committed regarding all the negotiations and the normative developments at the UN level. We also support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. You have here on the bottom a picture of Mrs. Andrea Bolaños Vargas, the new Special Rapporteur. So basically, we do fund a junior professional officer position in her team. It's not always easy for the special rapporteurs to have the resources. So the idea is to have a young Swiss professional who helps her during her mandate and who, analyzes the situation, etc. So we have heard for many years that the special rapporteurs are very grateful for this support Switzerland provides. And not last but not least, we do collaborate with a number of partner organizations. I'm sure many of you in the virtual room know them in a way. So basically, we fund these organizations which are specialized in the HRD protection to really implement. So it's a project basis. And some organizations are able to provide direct support to human rights defenders, such as frontline defenders. Others work more on a normative, at a normative level. ISHR, for example, is giving every year trainings for HRDs. There is one currently taking place this week in Geneva. So we do support those organizations since many years, actually. And one important aspect of these three pillars is that we really see them as complementary. So to give you an example, we do have a human rights dialogue with Brazil, where we do speak about the situation of HRDs. We also tried to, when the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders went to Brazil for a mission, the Swiss embassy hosted an event with her so that she could brief the diplomatic community about the challenges of the country. And finally, we support a project of a Brazilian organization which trains Brazilian human rights defenders and brings them to Geneva to interact with the human rights mechanisms. So it's just an example to show you that we work in a holistic approach to try to make these three pillars working together and to be as effective as they can be. Also, another example, in 2023 to 24, Switzerland was a member of the UN Security Council, and it was very important for us that civil society gets access to the Security Council. So we did invite a number of civil society briefers to brief about the respective situation. But one main concern was really to make sure that they felt safe, not during their participation, but also before and after it. So here we collaborated a lot with frontline defenders and with ISHR to develop some standard operating procedures for our colleagues to make sure to have a risk analysis assessment before the meeting, the days before the meetings and the hours before the meeting, to take some very concrete measures to limit the risks, but also on the longer term, when they were back home, to make sure that everything was fine, etc. So we really benefit a lot from the expertise of this specialized organization to make our diplomacy more effective and safer for human rights defenders. Good, we can move to the next slide. Thank you so much. So when it comes to HRD protection, our guiding principle, and I'm sure everyone will agree, is do no harm. So we are in direct contact with the HRDs, but if they are in detention, for example, or if they have to hide, we do liaise, or the partner organizations liaise with the family members, with the legal representatives, etc. But it's very important to make sure that we have the authorization to do anything before taking any action. Also, one important aspect is that we don't provide direct financial support. We do not have the capacity as a state sitting in our offices thousands kilometers away to analyze the situation and to provide the best answer. So that's why we partner with specialized organizations which are able to analyze the situation and to provide the support the HRD needs most. What we do is some kind of protection, but not financial one, except of course the fact that we fund the partner organizations. And here I put some example of diplomatic instruments we use when it comes to HRD protection. So I mentioned before the démarche diplomatique. So basically it's sending a note verbal to the authorities, for example, to ask them about the situation of a concrete HRD case, which is concerning for us. It might also be to request a visit to a detention center, or basically to raise the fact that we are following up the situation very closely. As you might know, Switzerland likes a lot to act behind closed doors in a discreet way, because we have experienced that sometimes it's the best way to get some advances. So you won't always, I mean, many things that colleagues do on a daily basis are not visible. But we also try to establish a kind of confidence to be able to speak about the HRD situation. Another example is the trial observation. In some countries, well, we all know that the criminalization of human rights defenders is rising, that the detention is used as a means to silence or at least to restrict HRD's work. So in some countries, our colleagues really go to the legal, to the trial, go observe trials. It's not always easy because we have Swiss embassies are not that big, you know, that some countries have hundreds of diplomats, etc. So we really have to also to work with like-minded countries and with institutions such as OHHR on the ground, etc., to make sure that there is an international community presence at the trials. So in some countries, there is a very active liaison group where the diplomats can share what trials are upcoming and where they can see, okay, where can we go to make sure that there is an international presence. Protejamos sus voces is another example of instrument that we might use. It was an initiative by the Swiss embassy in Mexico in collaboration with OHHR and other like-minded countries. And the idea was really to make a public campaign. So they selected 12 HRDs, if I remember correctly, that for a year that they followed very closely the situations of these HRDs, and also there was a whole campaign on social media to visibilize their work. They also posted photographs when they met them. So there was like a very close accompaniment for these HRDs, and it gave them really. By giving them this visibility, we all know that it also helps when it comes to their security, because they know that some countries are following up very closely their situation. Visits to detention centers, that is something that might come in a certain countries. It's not always easy to, of course, to get the access, but we do send some diplomatic notes to request for visits. Also, if the colleagues are like on a mission far away from the capital, it might be an opportunity to visit some HRDs in detention. And finally, there is a picture with a HRD from Latin America. So be it in Bern, in Geneva, or at the embassies on the ground, we do meet very often with human rights defenders. It's true that many defenders also come to Geneva to interact with HR mechanisms present in Geneva. So it's a good opportunity for us to meet with HRD delegations. Often it also happens ahead of the Universal Periodic Reviews, UPR. And for us, it's very useful to to meet with the HRDs to know a bit, on what aspects they want a country like Switzerland to do recommendations. And more generally, it's a very, when we meet HRDs, it's a very good opportunity to listen firsthand of their stories, of their challenges, etc. And for us, it gives us a very precise situation. And after the meeting, we liaise with the embassy or with our other colleagues in Bern to try to follow up accordingly. So I guess that's I hope it gave you a bit of an overview of what Switzerland might do. Of course, it's not exhaustive, but I would say it's on a daily basis what our colleagues do around the world and also in Geneva and in Bern. Next slide, please. So finally, when it comes to challenges, I mean, Alvaro already mentioned it in the introduction. We know that globally there is a clear trend toward the restriction of civic space. That's something that we really feel. I've been working in this position since 4 years, and I could really see the evolution, the negative evolution, not only globally, but also the discussions at the Human Rights Council, for example, are becoming more and more difficult. So there are challenging times. I mentioned before the transnational repression. That's something also a topic that comes more and more. For Switzerland, it's very important, and it's one of our priorities actually, that civil society gets access to the International Geneva and to the HR mechanisms. But it's also true that there are cases of transnational repression in Switzerland as well. So we did fund a project last year regarding this phenomenon to understand it better. And it's a matter on which we will be working the next years as well. Also the impact of digital technologies, surveillance. I mean, Patrick mentioned in the introduction as well that we have to be very careful when we use our smartphones, etc. That's also why I don't mention any names, or I remain quite general when it comes to countries, because you never know, and we have to be quite cautious. So it's true that it's clear that the needs are increasing, and that there is a financial pressure for the HRD protection. We do rely on the decisions of the Swiss Parliament regarding the budget we do have. And of course, there is also a kind of competition between different thematics. I introduced at the beginning our thematic priorities. So for the moment, we have been able to maintain the same level of financial commitment, but it might be a challenge in the future. And on a very concrete basis, also for the HRDs who are with us today and who maybe already have some contacts with the Swiss representations around the world, one challenge for you and for us is that the fact that the diplomatic staff rotates every 3 to 4 years. So we might have colleagues coming to a new country who haven't been working on HRD protection at all, and that's why we developed this HRD, this toolkit to help them. But also generally, we have to raise the awareness of the issue of human rights defenders, because if you don't know what a human rights defender is, if you haven't met one or until today, there is a learning curve, and it's a challenge for us to make sure that all the diplomats know our policy in the matter. So we have meetings also in Bern before some of them go abroad. We have, of course, regular contacts per email or per phone, and we have this toolkit. And for HRDs themselves, it's true that sometimes you have been able to establish ties with certain colleagues. There was a kind of trust that could be built, and if the colleague changed, you have to rebuild this trust. So we know it's a challenge, but we try to remain quite clear in the instruments we have, so that the colleagues can guide you best. And of course, the impact on bilateral relations. I'm speaking as a state representative, so it's true we always have to take into consideration the whole bilateral relations. There might be some competing interests between various departments within the ministry. So that might also be a challenge in certain cases to make sure that we are all working to the same direction. I think I'll stop here, and I would be very happy to take some questions if there are some after Ruki's intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia, also for sticking to the time right to the minute. You covered a lot of ground, very, very useful points that I'm sure we will come back to in the questions. I like how you spoke about the quiet diplomacy versus public diplomacy, which of course is a huge topic that we can discuss. The concrete ways in which Switzerland supports institution architecture through the UN Special Rapporteur, through NGOs, through human rights defenders, the do no harm principle. I just took so many notes of the things that you were saying. Perhaps one thing also that is good to reflect for the defenders in the webinar, it's to never underestimate the importance of telling your stories. The power that, especially maybe for a diplomat that, as Cecilia mentioned, doesn't have that background in human rights, to really realize the extent of the work, it can be really transformational. Okay, many interesting points that we can come back to. I certainly have a few questions already, but perhaps we can move to the second speaker, who is Ruki Fernando. As I mentioned at the start, Ruki Fernando is a writer, is a human rights defender, and a trainer from Sri Lanka, whose knowledge and whose expertise is called upon by many, including ourselves, of course. Because of his work on human rights, he was a target of previous governments in Sri Lanka. He was detained using anti-terrorism legislation, which is a very common legislation that is misused to target defenders. And this resulted on urgent action by human rights defenders, by NGOs, by diplomats that managed to secure his release. So I think he's a walking testament of the value of these conversations and of this work. So Ruki, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Happy to be part of a webinar that is organized by, I think, DTP, with whom I have worked for quite a long time, and also Frontline Defenders also have worked for a long time, and with the Swiss Embassy in Colombo also I have worked for a very long time, some of which I will refer to during the course of my sharing. So I won't talk much about human rights, who are human rights defenders, except saying that they are people who individually or with others act to promote and protect human rights. So that's the particular group that we are kind of talking about today. So they could be anyone, they could be survivors of violations, they could be victims' families, students, teachers, journalists, lawyers, different people. And I think this is important because sometimes the protection and support that is offered is denied based on who they are, not necessarily on what they do as a human rights activist. They could be working at local, national, regional, international level, or a combination. Again, this is important because often my experience is that those working at national level, regional level, international level have benefited more from protection support offered by diplomats, and those working at local level have benefited less. So they could be focusing on one or more rights, but of course subject to the recognition of the universality of all rights. So those are just some basic things. I think in the previous webinar, this UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders was discussed. So that is important for a variety of reasons, for which I will not go into detail now. So these are some of the things that are very important for human rights defenders, highlighted in the Human Rights Defenders Declaration. Assembly, association, opinion expression, but also right to do human rights education, right to get resources, including funding, including experts locally and abroad, and right to remedy if a violation happens. So I will, with that background, I will come to the main kind of a sharing that I will do about diplomats, human rights, and human rights defenders. Now, I have never been a diplomat in my life, but I had the opportunity to work very closely with many diplomats in Sri Lanka and occasionally with a few outside Sri Lanka as well, and quite a number in Geneva. And I've had many positive experiences, some of which is very personal, but some of it is also more generic. But I've also had some negative experiences. So I think this is part of our activism as human rights defenders to work with diplomats. Like we work in the streets, we work in courts, we work through media, and we take various other approaches as well. So this is just one approach. This is not a magical approach that will solve all our problems. So I feel diplomats are present as guests of the host government, and they are representative of their government. So that's their primary identity. And human rights can be part of the foreign policy of a country, like, for example, Switzerland, which was described by Cecilia. This can vary from country to country. Different countries have different human rights policies and priorities as part of their foreign policy. And even in the case of one country, the change of a government within one country can result in the change of foreign policy and particularly change of human rights policy. And as I think Cecilia kind of alluded to it, and I can say it probably more explicitly, that human rights policy can compete with political, economic, military, and immigration policy and practice of a particular country, which may sometimes compete with and override human rights policy and practice. And I think this is something that I have experienced personally, and I think it's good for human rights defenders to remember as a limitation. So more diplomats can engage with things which are more political in nature, but linked to human rights, like the right to self-determination, or even when there's struggles going on for regime change, like we experienced in Sri Lanka a few years ago, and even in our neighboring countries like in Nepal and in Bangladesh. But there can be less political, but more, what I would call directly human rights related issues like police torture or rights of the LGBTQ community and many others. And this can include protection and support to human rights defenders. So the diplomatic engagement can be at the multilateral level through intergovernmental bodies. And I think a good example of this is the UN Human Rights Council, which can decide to have fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiries, evidence-gathering processes, etc. So I'm somewhat familiar with Myanmar, but I'm also quite familiar with Sri Lanka because I've engaged extensively for many years with this process. And also, Cecilia alluded to the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, which covers all countries. So this is primarily a diplomatic engagement. So this is where political diplomatic decisions are taken in relation to human rights issues. So these are, I would call, more political diplomatic bodies, and I wouldn't call them necessarily human rights bodies. So I want to flash this example of resolutions on Sri Lanka in relation to atrocities committed during the war and afterwards, about seeking accountability and reconciliation. So several resolutions have been passed at the Human Rights Council, and the resolutions at the Human Rights Council are always decisions of diplomatic representatives of those particular countries, and they are of course guided by the capital of that particular country. So they vote yes, no, or they abstain. So these are very clear political diplomatic decisions. So we should not mistake diplomatic engagement as a substitute for human rights defenders' engagements. So I have engaged with diplomats in Geneva in relation to, there's many resolutions on Sri Lanka, and I have seen how it can vary, particularly when a government of a particular country changes, their positions can change. And I have experienced this firsthand in Geneva. I have also seen how the positions of countries within even the same region can vary. So this is a little bit more detailed about that the previous slides, how different diplomats representing their governments in the capital have voted at the Human Rights Council on a very, very clear human rights issue in relation to Sri Lanka. But we can also think of the bilateral engagement. The capital in another country engaging in our country with the High Commission or the embassy. For example, the capital in Bern could engage with the Sri Lankan embassy or the mission in Switzerland, representing the Sri Lankan government. And that often happens. And that often extends to human rights issues. And then there are visitors from the capital to our country. Very recently, we had a visitor from Bern who is dealing with Sri Lanka to Sri Lanka. He was in Colombo, in the capital, but he didn't limit himself to Colombo. He even went to the war-affected northern region, which he has done before. And he was even present at a very emotionally charged, politically controversial memorial for people who were killed during the end of the war. And this week, we are having some visitors from the United Kingdom, and they usually meet with human rights defenders as well. Although the number of human rights defenders they meet are usually very small, and often the people in Colombo, in the capital, get more priority. And then, of course, the embassies, the other country's embassy in my country, like in my case, Sri Lanka, also engage in bilateral things. Like I think I would take the example of the Australian High Commission and the Switzerland Embassy in Colombo, with whom I have engaged for significant periods. And some of these countries have guidelines on human rights defenders. I think one of the first was the European Union guidelines. European Union is, of course, not one country, but 27 countries. So it's a bit more complicated. But countries like Netherlands, Finland, the United Kingdom, Ireland, Norway, Canada, and the United States of America have come up with guidelines. And sometimes they were not called guidelines on human rights defenders. They were, other names were used, but they were generally similar in nature. Some of them, I think, have gone they're not in use anymore. They have been withdrawn or they have been replaced with something else. And I think Cecilia mentioned that the Swiss guidelines that were in place are kind of no longer in use as such, but they are in the process of coming up with something new. But this is it was there in the previous years or decade or so. So these are some of the things that the guidelines would usually say. Monitor the situation of human rights defenders, visit prisons if human rights defenders are detained. And now I recall that I collaborated with diplomats in Colombo on visiting human rights defenders who were detained at a time when it was very particularly difficult for human rights defenders in Sri Lanka, much more difficult, dangerous than it is right now. I recall on Christmas Day, a Swiss diplomat went with me to visit a human rights defender who was detained. And that particular diplomat, I think, was exceptionally committed. That's why even on a holiday like Christmas Day, she was willing to visit a human rights defender to provide moral support, with some Swiss chocolates, which was, I think, very much appreciated by that particular human rights defender. And then more recently, the EU diplomat visited a human rights student leader who was in detention. And we collaborated in terms of planning these visits, but also providing interpreters, for example. There have been situations where diplomats observed court cases where human rights defenders were tried, but diplomats have also observed court cases where perpetrators of violence against human rights defenders were being tried. And this has happened quite a lot in Sri Lanka. It is still happening. Providing safe houses is something that has also happened. And of course, this has to be done quite quietly. So this may not necessarily be well known. I think I can recall a particular instance where a Swiss diplomat even offered me protection in that house, providing safe accompaniment. This is literally becoming an unarmed bodyguard. We've had human rights defenders in Sri Lanka who were accompanied by diplomats even to the airport, even back when they were returning back from the airport, and various other situations. Visiting human rights defenders in their areas of work, in their houses, offices. I recall a situation where the office, human rights office, was bombed, subject to a grenade attack in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, and some diplomats visited the office immediately afterwards. Human rights defenders get invited to embassies. They attend events by human rights defenders, and they also organize events for human rights defenders. And all these are things that have been done by the Swiss, and I'm referring to the Swiss in particular because no Cecilia's presence, but also others in Sri Lanka, and especially during the period 2007 to 2014, at a very difficult, dangerous time in Sri Lanka for human rights defenders. But rather unfortunately, I think the level of engagement by diplomats in terms of support and protection for human rights defenders have, I think, reduced over the years, but that is my personal experience and observation. This is a particular situation where public statements were made by the capitals, not just in Colombo, when I was arrested with along with another human rights defender, and this has happened several times in relation to Sri Lanka, but also in other parts of the country. So it's not always private engagement. Sometimes there's also public engagement, like public statements made. And then demarches as well, which is rare and which is, of course, done often quietly. Special visas have been issued. I believe they are issued locally, but may require approval from the capital. But I recall instances where the United States, Norway, Germany, and Switzerland issued visas to human rights defenders just to ensure their protection. Now, I recall that certain people human rights defenders to whom protective visas were issued, never actually used them. Because the whole idea of a protective visa was that if that person faces imminent danger, that human rights defender doesn't have to go through the hassle of a very bureaucratic administrative procedure of applying for visas, going for interviews, etc. So I personally know human rights defenders in Sri Lanka who were issued visas to go to the US, to Norway, who did not use those visas at all, because fortunately, those situations did not arise. But they had that protection, and that was a massive strength of support for them at that particular time. I recall a visa issued by Germany, a national visa, not just a Schengen visa, for I think for about 9 months or something, for which the human rights defender used about 3 years ago. But that human rights defender came back a bit early because he felt that the situation was a bit better. And the Swiss has done also similar things in Sri Lanka. And this is also in the past and even present include visits to the UN. And there has also been some degree of funding for human rights defenders at the international level by different diplomatic missions in Colombo, in Sri Lanka. In recent years, the Swiss has engaged with families of disappeared who are women human rights defenders in Sri Lanka. This has gone on for several years, and I think for nearly a decade or so, bringing diverse women human rights defenders together, providing them training at national and particularly at international level, and also helping them and supporting them to engage with UN treaty bodies, most recently last year with the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, because that was the issue that they were most concerned with. So after a prolonged engagement in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, some of them were supported, some of these women human rights defenders were supported by the Swiss embassy in Colombo to visit Geneva to engage with the Committee on Enforced Disappearances. And I think in the so-called old Swiss human rights defenders guidelines, the importance of Swiss hosting the United Nations human rights bodies in Geneva is particularly noted. And that Switzerland encourages the active participation in Geneva, for example, at the UN sessions, Human Rights Council sessions, as part of the UPR, etc. And that Swiss was promoting the participation of human rights defenders, even at the stage when the Human Rights Council was being set up. That was around 2006. And I think there is also a body called Kaji. No, I don't know whether I pronounce it correctly, which is supported by the Swiss Confederation and particularly the Republic of Geneva, the Canton of Geneva, to support human rights defenders. And I think me personally and other human rights defenders from Sri Lanka who have visited Geneva, including even last year, have benefited from the support of this particular institution. And I think it's an institution that many of us can seek support from if we are going to Geneva physically. But we've also had negative experiences of the Swiss making it very difficult for human rights defenders to engage with the UN, especially in relation to visas, and also because the cost of going to Geneva is very high. Geneva is one of the most expensive capitals in the world, including within Europe. So I think no, we should not take it for granted that the UN human rights bodies should always be in Geneva or in Switzerland. If no, it is too difficult for the Swiss to make it facilitate the participation of human rights defenders, I think we should consider shifting the UN human rights bodies to another country which is more ready to facilitate and make it easy for human rights defenders to engage. And I want to end by coming back a little bit to Asia and Pacific, which is the region I am from. and which is the region I have spent my time with and worked mostly. And I think there are few initiatives of various governments within Asia in relation to human rights and human rights defenders. And I think we should try to use those initiatives and to push for more initiatives from within our region of Asia Pacific. And I want to cite two examples. One, the photo is an example from Timor-Leste. I have also been to the invitation of the DTP, and I think the president of the Timor-Leste, Ramos Horta, have been engaging with human rights defenders from different parts of the world, particularly Asia Pacific, whenever we visited and whenever the DTP holds trainings there. And this is one such photo, and I was also part of such engagement. And I recall after I met the president together with many others from the DTP training program a couple of years back. It was a very warm engagement. First, there was a formal engagement, then there was an informal engagement. And then I recall that the president wanted to meet few human rights defenders from Myanmar, which was facing a particularly difficult situation at that time, even after that, for a more private engagement. So I think this is an example where I think leaders of heads of other states and diplomats from other countries can also follow this positive example from Timor-Leste. And of course, I think we also identify Ramos Horta some time ago as a human rights defender who himself was fighting for human rights of his country before he became president or before he became a foreign minister. And likewise, I think we might have others in other countries in our region, but even in countries like Latin America, who were survivors of human rights violations or families of people who suffered human rights violations or human rights defenders who now go on to hold state positions. And I think most recently, one of my friends from South Korea was appointed as a human rights ambassador by the South Korean government. So I think these are opportunities for us to engage more with initiatives within the Asia-Pacific region for the support and protection of human rights defenders, particularly human rights defenders who face reprisals. So I will end by kind of trying to draw a link between the practice and the policy. So I mentioned that my engagement with with the Swiss embassy in Colombo was about 2006 or 2007, and I think the Swiss guidelines came much after that. And my observation, I don't know whether this is right or wrong, is that the Swiss guidelines was very much informed by the Swiss practice in countries like Sri Lanka. So I think this is a good approach where the practice can inform the policy. But on the other hand, I think for certain others, the policy can inform the practice, and the policy can help to bring about a more positive practice. And I think both these can work. And finally, I think the personal commitment of the individuals are very important. Now, I want to recall very warmly some of the diplomats in Colombo were very helpful to us. But also, I think the policy institutional commitment is very important. I think however much a diplomat is committed personally, what he or she could do is very limited without policy institutional commitment. So that's why I think it's important to talk about guidelines and any such policy framework. And for human rights defenders, before we do engage with diplomats, I think it's good to do our homework on both the personal dimension of the diplomats who are involved in this and from whom we seek support, but also on the policy institutional framework. Even if it's an internal document, I think having an internal document like which the Swiss is planning will make it a little bit more difficult for human rights defenders to engage, rather than having a more transparent public policy document like the one that Swiss used to have. And I also know that because I think you mentioned, Cecilia, that you are in the process, I want to recall that the Swiss were engaged in a very consultative process. I remember participating in a consultation in Bern as a human rights defender before the Swiss guidelines on human rights defenders were formulated. So I hope that the present ones that are being revised, updated, and also in other countries, will also have this more participatory approach and will draw on the input and experiences of human rights defenders also. So thank you very much again for inviting me.
Many thanks, Ruki, for that presentation, and as well for sticking to the time perfectly, much like Cecilia. I found very interesting the way in which you've really illustrated from your experience, from your work, the huge diversity of the types of protection that there can be for human rights defenders. And not all of them is always involves money, right? There's a big component of accompaniment. There's a big component of solidarity. You brought visas into the conversation, and I think it's so important. No conversation around protection of human rights defenders can ignore the issue of visas, and it's unfortunately a field where things are not getting easier because of political concerns. But I think both Cecilia and you spoke about something very interesting when you spoke about the personal commitment of diplomats, when you spoke about the staff turnover, when Cecilia was mentioning all the policy framework that there is to guide diplomats, which is something that we really need to remember when we engage with the diplomats, which is we are not asking diplomats to do a favor to us. We are asking diplomats to fulfill the commitments of their states. States like Switzerland, like many others, have very strong commitments on human rights defenders. So when we reach out to them for support, we are not asking them for favors. We are asking them to implement what they themselves have chosen to commit to. In that sense, there's something I always, when I speak with diplomats, with ministries, it's that diplomats need the 3 R's. They need to be reminded, they need to be reassured, and they need to be resourced. They need to be reminded of what I just said, of the commitments, of the work, that human rights work is not something extracurricular to do after work if you have the time. They need to be reassured. As both Cecilia and Ruki mentioned, often doing human rights work in a country that is hostile to the situation is not easy. There will be pushback, there will be political pressure, there are competing priorities. So even the most well-meaning diplomats often find themselves at pressure to do the right thing. So that's why they need reassurance from their capitals, from their ministries, that if they stick out their neck for human rights defenders, their governments will have their back. And last, they will be resourced. They need to be resourced. It doesn't matter how well-meaning, how much good work a diplomat wants to do, but if they are hugely stretched, they have no budget, they have no support, there is only so much you can do. Cecilia, I don't know if you agree with this. I'll give you the word in a second if you want to push back or to disagree. But going back to Ruki's intervention, also thank you for talking quite honestly and sometimes slightly provocatively about the challenges in the field, the fact that some defenders have better access to diplomatic support, and this can be because of location. Defenders in capital always have better access to international support because of language, because of identity, frankly, because of state priorities as well. Thanks for sharing some thoughts on Geneva, hosting the UN human rights bodies, and the challenges, but the opportunities that also presents. We are doing very well with time. I've seen already a few good questions in the chat. Perhaps before we go to that, I don't know if Cecilia, Ruki, you want to 2 minutes add anything that you may have forgotten from your presentations. Otherwise, we can go directly to the questions.
If you allow me, I will just make a comment regarding the human rights mechanisms being in Geneva and the fact that it's the visa issue and the costs of the city. I think we have to be very cautious when we speak about moving the mechanisms to another city, because in Geneva there is a whole ecosystem of human rights. Of course, there is the Human Rights Council, there are the treaty bodies, etc., but there are also many organizations present in Geneva which have an extensive knowledge about the mechanisms. There is the academic sector, there is other international organizations where we can also make synergies, etc. So I'm not sure moving to the mechanisms to another city would be more effective. And the visa issue, it's true that it's a difficult process because it's long. You have to provide a lot of documents, etc. We always say to human rights defenders, take really time prepare in advance, because we know that having the right documentation, having to go to the consulate, etc., it's a lot of energy you have to invest, and it's of course I understand that it can be a burden for defenders who have to travel, etc. But I think we really have to keep in mind the human rights ecosystem in Geneva, which is very important for Switzerland, and we work with KAJI and with other measures really to try to accompany best civil society representatives who want to come to Geneva. So just a comment on my hand. Thank you.
Since I was given the opportunity, I will say no, just maybe 2 comments. That I think the best of human rights diplomacy and the best of human rights diplomacy in terms of human rights defenders protection will come out in the worst of political situations, in the most oppressive, repressive situations. We will see the best of diplomacy, I think, in terms of human rights. And I think I've seen a little bit of that in Sri Lanka, including from the Swiss, from the Germans, from the French, and several others in the past. The second, I think, is also that unfortunately diplomats have not also been spared of reprisals. No? And I recall even in Sri Lanka, even a Swiss person who was a staff member of the Swiss embassy also faced reprisals, and various others have also not been spared. So I think this is the reality that we have to deal with in terms of human rights activism, and when we think of supporting and protecting human rights defenders at risk. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both. So perhaps I'll start with the questions in the chat, but I just wanted to highlight a comment that Isan Khan has written that I really liked. And he says, protecting those who protect others is not only an act of gratitude, it's an investment in a more just, democratic, and humane future for all. And I think that's a very, frankly, smart way of looking at protection of human rights defenders. There's a couple short questions about frontline defenders specifically. I'll just reply to that in 2 minutes. Somebody's asking if there's any French diplomats or frontline defenders member here. I can't speak for French diplomats, but I do work for frontline defenders. So if you want to ask anything in the chat, please go ahead. And somebody else asked, what's the difference between the mandate of frontline defenders and others like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, etc.? I would say that frontline defenders' mandate is very, very clearly limited or targeted towards the protection of human rights defenders, rather than Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. They work on broader human rights topics. But perhaps let's move to the first question, which is on defenders who are in exile or who are abroad. It asks, if a human rights defender escapes persecution in their home country, but then faces insecurity, hate campaigns, and limited access to protection in their country of asylum, can we still say that the international protection system is working? What urgent reforms are needed to ensure that protection is a reality rather than a promise? I'm going to copy it again in the chat just for reference of the speakers. And Cecilia, Ruki, let me know if you want to reply to that.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Thank you for the question. When I spoke about the new challenges of transnational repression, of digitalization, HRD in exile is another one. I mean, it's a fact that there are more and more HRDs who have to flee their country. For our policy, it doesn't change anything in the sense that we will engage with HRDs wherever they are based or working. So basically, if there is a HRD in a country who tells stories about persecution, etc., we would then liaise with the authorities back home or try to do any action, diplomatic action with the countries of the origin country. But it's true that it's on the normative level, there is still a lot to do at the UN level to reflect those developments. I don't know, Alvaro, if you want to complement with your experience at Frontline.
Yeah, but perhaps, Ruki, do you want to answer first and I can complement?
Yes. So I think a human rights defender is a human rights defender, irrespective of whether that person is in the country of his or her origin or in a different place. Now, if the persecution is linked to his or her human rights activism, he or she deserves protection and support, irrespective of the geographical location. So I think they should get support. And I think in a way, people who are human rights defenders who are in exile, and I have also been for at least a few months in exile, I think definitely need support, including from the local human rights defenders of the country they are in, but also from the diplomatic community there. But and I think there has been a pattern of persecution. For example, I recall Vietnamese human rights defenders who were abducted when they escaped to Thailand. So I think there are many situations like that where they can face very serious persecution. Even if they don't face persecution, they need support. But also, I think the host country, to the extent possible, should also have extend support to human rights defenders who are residing in their own country. Now, for example, if there are human rights defenders from Sri Lanka residing in Switzerland, I think the Swiss government should also consider extra support for those human rights defenders.
Yeah, thanks, boss. I completely agree with Cecilia that the issue of transnational repression is getting bigger and bigger. There has always been transnational repression, but now an increasing number of countries do it, and they do it in an increasingly brazen way. And the reality is that the current system is not designed to address the protection needs of human rights defenders in exile. I think the way, and we are also to blame for that. I mean, frontline defenders, but in general, international NGOs who work in protection, we work under this assumption that once the person leaves the country, the main risk is gone, and we see that that's not the case, no? And we also see that increasingly defenders who go in exile are not able to return to their countries. It's not like a temporary solution. So I think there's been a lot of conversation on how to tackle this, and also beyond the security, even if the defender is secure, how do we ensure that they can continue their human rights work? Because beyond security needs, there's also economic security needs. And if a defender has to stop doing their human rights work to focus on a job that will allow them to stay afloat, economically speaking, there's also a huge loss there. Because human rights defenders in exile still do such a huge and important work when they can afford to do so. The next question is also related to human rights defenders in exile, who are refugees, who are stateless. And it says, human rights defenders often work under immense pressure, facing security risk. From your experience, what more can governments, diplomats, and international organizations do to provide protection that is meaningful, funding, and long-term support to defenders, particularly when those defenders are from refugee communities, they're stateless, like the Rohingya?
Yeah, that's of course a difficult question. Well, as I mentioned before, Switzerland would not provide direct financial support. So for longer term perspective, we will advise to turn to partner organizations. But we know, as Alvaro mentioned just a minute ago, that it's very difficult to be able to continue working as a HRD when you are in another country, when you have to, maybe find a job just to be able to stay. So it is really a challenge, and I'm not sure I have the answer yet. As I said before, it's really a growing phenomenon. I think Alvaro and I were in Dublin last week. It was also at the summit. It's also one of the HRDs in exile is really one of the questions where all the actors have to come together and to think about concrete ways to better protect HRDs who have to flee the country. And we are at the beginning of this strategic thinking.
Thank you, Cecilia. Ruki, there's a question directly for you, which is, what is the advice that you can give for young human rights defenders when dealing with diplomats in the Global South context? Which one, policy to practice or practice to policy, preferred?
As I mentioned, I think it's we cannot say that the policy to practice is the best way or the other way around is the best way. I think it depends on circumstances. In certain situations, I think both can work. But I think the time when the European Union, for example, started to come up with guidelines is like 20 years ago. No, so it's more than 10 years ago that the Swiss came up with these guidelines. So now we do have a significant practice, whether it's for good or bad. So I think we should consider both the good and the bad of the practice and then try to inform policy through this. Because if we don't have policy, we will be far too dependent on the goodness of individual diplomats. And as I mentioned, I think an individual diplomat can do to a very limited extent if there is no policy institutional support. So I think by now, the practice must be carefully assessed, reviewed, and inform policy.
Thank you, Ruki. There's also, I should say, a lot of messages of appreciation in the chat for the interventions. So that's also important to note. There's a few questions that are very country specific, and I will maybe read them together. But just as a note, we don't necessarily have the experts in the different countries in the webinar. So it might be challenging to like really answer to the specificities of several of specific countries. But well, no risk in reading them, of course. There's a participant who is asking specifically about the support for indigenous peoples in Nepal. So they say that in Nepal, defenders are threatened by the state when we talk about human rights, about indigenous rights, about access to land, and that there's a struggle that has been going on for a long time, but no diplomats have been able to assist indigenous peoples in Nepal. So that's one question. Another country-specific question, going to the other side of the world, is the fact that despite having national legislation on the protection of human rights defenders, Colombia continues to lead in the number of killings of defenders. So what are the gaps and the challenges that contribute to this situation? Perhaps we can take these two and we can continue later. I have some thoughts as well in case the defender.
Well, I think regarding Colombia, it's a very good example of quite comprehensive national protection policies being in place, but we see that in the implementation year after year, Colombia remains the most dangerous country for human rights defenders at least when it comes to killings. Our colleagues at the embassy have been working a lot with human rights defenders also on auto-protection, self-protection, to try to, also, especially for defenders working in very remote areas far away from the capital, they supported some projects to try to foster a bit this self-protection. As Alvaro said, I'm not an expert, so I should ask for more information. But the idea was really to fill the gap and to see where the challenges are. If there is no concrete protection measure, be it like with bodyguards or bulletproof jackets, etc., to foster some auto-protective mechanisms. But it's true that in Latin America, generally, we have some quite advanced policies at the national level, also in Mexico, for example, but the implementation remains a big challenge. And for the other question regarding Nepal, well, I remember meeting with delegations we have a partner organization called Peace Brigades International, which works on Nepal. So we did have some meetings and really tried also to inform our colleagues internally of the situation. So I don't think there are no interactions, but it's true that for the challenge also here remains the implementation and the dialogue with the authorities.
I'll respond to the one about Nepal, which is actually not only about Nepal. I think it is more about the provincial governments in any country. And I think that's a very important thing. And I think provincial governments or cities, city councils, etc., can do a lot to support human rights defenders. And I think this can go back to the question about exiled human rights defenders as well. So where if a particular human city has a very policy priority to support human rights defenders from other countries and other regions who are in their particular city or in their province, I think that can be a very positive initiative. And I think there's already been some such initiatives going on. For example, some cities in the Netherlands have started this initiative called Shelter City, which is run for human rights defenders at risk from other countries. It is limited for a very temporary period of 3 months. But I think what was started by one city in Netherlands was replicated in other cities in the Netherlands. And it also went, I think, to some cities in other countries are also starting that. So I think that's one dimension. But I think also a city can also pass sub-laws or take policy decisions in relation to how they deal with human rights defenders from their own city, local human rights defenders. And I think setting up a positive example from one city or one province would go a long way in helping to take this forward, the practice of supporting and protecting human rights defenders. So I think provincial governments or cities engaging on human rights defenders protection could be a very important dimension for the future. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you both as well. There's a few questions on the broader backlash against gender, against women human rights defenders, against transgender rights activists. So particularly, a defender, a participant, speaks about how Indonesia, her community, is running some activities, including organizing free of charge classes for young people to discuss gender, sexuality. There's someone else asking, how can young transgender people engage in human rights advocacy in a way that builds understanding and constructive dialogue within their communities? Someone else is asking or is mentioning the growing backlash against these communities in Malaysia, in Pakistan. So, would you have any reflections on the protection of these defenders and how can we support their work?
I can reply in general because I'm not very familiar with all the country situations that's mentioned. I'm primarily working in Sri Lanka. But in general, I think it's important in the framework of protection and support for human rights defenders to look out for human rights defenders with particular identities or working on particular human rights issues who are more at risk in a particular place or at a particular time. And I think, for example, transgender activists could fall into that category in some countries at some particular times. And it has been the case in Sri Lanka as well. So I think they require more attention and more support. But I think this also has to be done very cautiously because sometimes visible engagement with some diplomats could have more negative repercussions. And I think this should be taken in line with what Cecilia said, the principle of do no harm. And I think if the measures that diplomats can take to support protect human rights defenders are taken in consultation with human rights defenders, I think the do no harm principle can be better implemented and better realized. Sorry, it's a bit vague because I'm not particularly familiar with the particular situation in specific countries.
Yeah, I totally
Thank you.
agree with what Ruki said. For this specific thematic of LGBTIQ rights protection, it's sometimes a challenge of not to be counterproductive because then we can often there is the narrative being used of wanting to impose Western values or neocolonialism, etc. So here we liaise really. Our embassy are in close contact with civil society organizations to make sure that any action would not be counterproductive. And regarding the fact that LGBTIQ rights defenders are more and more targeted, I think the statistics show it. It's sure that it's a group who needs special protection because they face intersectional discrimination and harassment.
Yeah, no, and we see like also in our own reporting, in our own data, that increasingly if you group together LGBT defenders and defenders working on gender, on equal rights and women's rights, they are by far the most targeted group of defenders in every region, and it's again not getting better. I have two questions that maybe I'll group, but they are just two big topics, so feel free to answer as you see. The first one is very straightforward, but I think it's very interesting, which is how useful is it for defenders to have connections to engage with mass media, with the use of social media? How do you see that sort of that side of the work? And the second one is on instances of criminalization. And well, as we mentioned, Ruki himself was targeted with anti-terrorism legislation back in the day. So the question is, where defenders are being targeted with false or politically motivated charges like terrorism, endangering state security, or even other charges that seem less obviously security related, like tax evasion, how do you support this kind of work when the authorities themselves insist that this has nothing to do with their human rights work, that this is related to other things?
Regarding the first question, I think Ruki will probably be the best speaker to answer regarding his strategies regarding media and social media. I think what we do witness, though, is that the use of social media. I mean, the states care about their reputation. So if there are many social media posts tagging the state X or Y regarding potential human rights violations, certainly is something that they will see. They might not react, but I think it's something to consider being a HRD, keeping in mind the fact that, I mean, your protection. I mean, is it worth taking the risk? I think it has to be very well thought, and maybe, yeah, use the expertise of organizations who could best guide you through this process, not to be to become even more target. Regarding the criminalization and the multiplication of these laws, various laws which restrict the civic space, that's a real challenge, because in the end it's the legislation is adopted by parliament, etc. So I think for Switzerland, what we can remind is that it's important to have to guarantee to safeguard the civic space, to that the NGOs can work, etc. But in the implementation, it's the use of these laws to criminalize human rights defenders. It's a real challenge also for us to engage. It's something that we can discuss during bilateral meetings, but here also you have to keep in mind that a lot of the narratives that is being used is the sovereignty, the foreign interference, etc. So we have to be very careful when in the political messages we want to transmit, not to be counterproductive.
I will respond on media. I think it varies from situation to situation, from human rights defender to human rights defender. So it's really impossible to kind of give any specific answer. But we all have to think when to use media and also when not to use media. There are many initiatives which human rights defenders are part of, which are not does not involve media, and we it might be counterproductive to involve media, but there are many initiatives for which media support is absolutely essential, which wouldn't work without media. And I think diplomats also follow governments also follow the same thinking pattern. That's why there is sometimes private diplomatic engagement and sometimes there's public diplomatic engagement. So it's good for us to always to consider in a particular situation at a particular time, in a particular circumstances, what is the best way we can use media, or whether it's better not to use media. That's kind of again, a very generic answer.
Thanks, Ruki. Cecilia, perhaps I have two questions for you. One is more broad and the other one is very concrete. So the first question is, could you share some reflections on how your ministry, the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, seems to have built this culture of support for defenders that predates the guidelines? It's true, it comes up that Swiss diplomats are active, are innovative, are personal commitment to human rights. So any sort of personal reflection on this that may be of interest? And then, very concretely, there's a question from the Coalition of Somali Human Rights Defenders, who is an OMCT partner and who has UN ECOSOC consultative status. So it asks, what practical mechanism can Switzerland provide to ensure that Somali human rights defenders have access to Geneva, since the Swiss embassy in Nairobi does not recognize ordinary Somali passports? And whether there's any alternative travel facilitation that Switzerland may be able to provide, such as laissez-passer visas.
Thank you. Well, regarding the first question, it's difficult to explain how this culture was built over the years. I think one very important aspect is that the protection of human rights is enshrined within our constitution under Article 54. So it's really a part of our foreign policy strategy to work on human rights. Also, I think what has helped over the years is that our priorities have remained quite stable. So it's the action of Switzerland is known in a certain in certain topics, and yeah, it's part. I don't want to say DNA of Swiss diplomacy, but I think Switzerland has long been recognized as a state willing to work on human rights in a very discreet way. So all the diplomats who work for Switzerland have been kind of in this, like, growing in this ecosystem. Of course, if you are posted in London, you might have less to do with human rights, but as soon as you move to another context where it's more challenging, based on, yeah, you will start working based on our strategies, etc. So yeah, I guess it's also related to the fact that we have very committed colleagues in many countries who are willing to make a difference, even though it's a small one. As Alvaro mentioned at the beginning, it might be only to meet the HRD and to listen to their stories, and it gets you a more concrete sense of the situation for human rights defenders. So I guess it's a bit a mixture of these various elements, not an easy one to answer. Regarding the second question, I'm afraid I won't have the answer right now because I don't know this specific country well enough. What I would suggest is that either through OMCT or per email, maybe I can copy the question and or if the person can put her or his email address, I will try to follow up because I don't have the answer elements right now. Sorry for that.
Perhaps we can facilitate the contact. I believe we should have it, right, Patrick? I made a note of who has a question, and perhaps we can share the email directly with Cecilia. Perfect. So then let's do that. I have a question that it's very dear to my heart because it's something that we are seeing increasingly in Europe. Although the question is about Australia, but the question asks: a recent legislative change in Australia threatens to make it almost impossible to speak out against the genocide in Palestine without facing criminal prosecution for anti-Semitism. Do human rights defenders or do the speakers have any advice around this? And perhaps I can just add briefly that this is something that we are really seeing in a number of countries, including countries that are meant to be more human rights compliant, to really crack down on protest, notably pro-Palestine protest or anti-genocide protest, but also increasingly related to climate change and environmental matters. So yeah.
Sure. Can I respond?
Please go ahead.
So I think this is a threat to the universality of human rights. So I think I have been, as I think was mentioned, I have been called a terrorist, and various others, many human rights defenders all over the world have been called terrorists and tagged as terrorists. I was more fortunate that I think many people, including diplomats, did not believe that I was a terrorist, and were able to say that I was not a terrorist even publicly. But that's not the case with many other human rights defenders. I think even in relation to the Palestinian question and the crackdowns on protest and those who advocate for Palestinian self-determination and highlighting genocide in Palestine and the reprisals they face, I think we have to consider it as reprisals against human rights defenders. Whether when the German police cracks down on protesters in Germany, that is a reprisal against a human rights defender. So it should a reprisal against human rights defenders should not be based on where it happens and which government or which private party is committing it. It should be based on the act itself. So I think this is, I think, why I think we should not depend on a certain number of countries. We should not, who traditionally call themselves or identify themselves as champions of human rights, but we should reach out to more and more other governments who might be more open in terms of offering support and protection to human rights defenders and human rights advocacy in general. And I think there are other countries in the Latin American region, in the Asia Pacific region, who we need to reach out to.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruki. Cecilia, I don't know if you want to comment on this one or if we continue. Okay. There's a couple more questions. We are running out of time, but I think we still have maybe time for a couple more questions. And I also wanted to highlight a contribution from a participant named Fanny, who is speaking about her strategies to organize events without being targeted by the authorities. And she shares, one of my strategies, particularly when promoting our activities for young people, is to tone down, starting from the choice of the titles with more neutral ones, not sharing our contact information, and not sharing the venues, the date, and the dates of our events. So far, this has worked well, although some authorities have found my number and have started calling me regarding the events of my community. Even now, I am very careful when planning to post my published articles, which are mostly published out of Indonesia. Thanks for sharing that experience, Fanny. It is really a shame that defenders like you have to go through, jump through these hoops. No, I really keep a very low profile. But if you see that that works for your context and for your community, that is good. There's a question that really speaks about intersectionality and how protection needs to be intersectional. So it's asking about how indigenous people with disabilities are often not recognized, or the institutional frameworks are not adapted to them. So it's asking very concretely, how can protection adapt to the needs of this group, which I think more broadly also speaks about the reality that, of course, defenders inhabit many different identities, all of them with different needs, and we run the risk by focusing too much on solely women human rights defenders. They're women, and if we don't take into account all other identity markers, we risk not providing effective protection. So I'm wondering if you have any question, any answer to that.
Well, certainly, thank you for the question. Certainly, it's an important aspect, the intersectionality, to take into consideration when it comes to protection strategies, also to think about maybe various paths to be more effective. I know that the new special rapporteur on human rights defenders would like to work more on the intersectionality. So maybe it would also be interesting to follow up what she will propose in that regard. I don't know if it will be a report or I mean, she has just started her mandate, but certainly it's something that we also discuss with our partner organizations, where we see that defenders are being targeted through various angles because of their identities. So it's something that's taken into consideration at the multilateral level when it comes to resolutions negotiation, where the inclusion of words like intersectionality can really make a difference, but also in the protection strategies that our partner organizations put in place. I think it's something that they are all very much aware of.
Thank you, Cecilia. Ruki, do you want to give your last answer before we wrap up?
Okay, so maybe I will take more something that I can say in a more positive way, and I think that's in relation to the comment or question from Nepal. No, so I think in Sri Lanka we've had very recently also some young lawyers, young activists, students also who are supporting human rights defenders who are in exile in Sri Lanka from other countries in the region. So I think that's a very positive thing, and I've also experienced this even in other countries, like in England, for example. I've experienced that where a protective fellowship for human rights defenders at risk, run by the University of York, depends on the support of the local community, and particularly young people who are very supportive for the human rights defenders at risk, who come to their city. So I think there are very practical ways, sometimes very small ways that young people, particularly students, can help human rights defenders who are at risk, even at the international level. So I think in general, I think human rights defenders protection is very kind of broad framework. I think there are broad frameworks now, but, more than before. So the engagement with diplomats is one such category. Of course, we should be very cautious not to overly depend on diplomats. But we should treat them that there's potential for them to be an ally in protecting human rights defenders at risk, and in the past they have been allies, although it's not perfect. It has never been perfect. So we hope that it can be improved as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruki. Really big thanks to Cecilia and to Ruki for their interventions today. and for having been answering questions non-stop for the last 35 minutes. I apologize. I was meant to wrap up like 10 minutes ago, but I got very lost in all the interesting questions and answers. So huge thanks to the speakers, but also thank you for the audience for spending 1 hour and a half with us very actively. Perhaps without further ado, I can hand over to Annelise to wrap up, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Alvaro, and thank you for giving us your time to moderate the webinar. You've done an excellent job. We've had some very interesting questions. And to Ruki and Cecilia, thank you very much for sharing your expertise on human rights defenders and how they can work with diplomats. This was the second of 3 webinars that will actually be running on the issue of human rights defenders. We'll be starting to plan our 3rd webinar shortly, so if anyone has any ideas about what they'd like us to discuss, feel free to send us an email and we'll be starting to put that together. Also, if you'd like to keep up to date about what the diplomacy training program is going to be doing, you can sign up to our newsletter and we'll be sending out emails periodically to let you know about new webinars and new events and what our alumni have been doing across Asia. Well, thank you very much again for joining us. It's been a very informative webinar. We hope to see you again at our next webinar, and we'll be sending a copy of this to everybody who attended via their emails, and also the presentation slides as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.